NATO versus Russia. Assuming neither side starts flinging mushroom clouds, what would a conventional war look like in terms of strength and numbers? Does the West have a reason to fear the Russian bear? Or are the days of the Cold War Soviet tank hordes long behind us? That is what we are going to be finding out today. For the few of you who may be unaware, by the way, NATO of course refers to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a defensive alliance signed into power on the 9th of April 1949 by the United States of America, Britain, France, Canada, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Portugal, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. The pivotal point of the treaty that has been mentioned frequently in relevance to the at the time of recording ongoing war in Ukraine is Article 5, that commits each of the member states to consider an attack on one as an attack on all. A very relevant point, as Ukraine shares a border with Poland, which is now also a NATO country. In fact, practically all of Europe is now in NATO, as the alliance has come a long way since its inception at the end of the 1940s. Meanwhile, NATO's original reason for existence, the Soviet Union, and later its own defensive alliance, the Warsaw Pact, has fallen an equally long way, to the point that Russia has today returned to the state commented on by the giant Tsar of the Russian Empire, Alexander III. Russia has only two allies, its army and its navy. Now, strictly speaking, this is not entirely true, as Russia does still have a few friends, like the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which consists of Russia, Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Military superpowers, these are not. And many of them's dedication to Russia, if push comes to shove, is wavering, shall we say, as is China's. The wishing upon a star to be superpower of Asia has at best a strained relationship with Russia, and beyond using a war as cover for their own military actions, is unlikely to engage openly in a fight between NATO and Russia. In all due likelihood, Russia will stand, just like Tsar Alexander said, alone. And that will form the basis for our strength estimates, just as the title says, NATO versus Russia. Now, a plus China scenario could certainly be interesting, of course, but I just do not see the dragon getting involved in a European war. At least not yet, as it would severely jeopardize its position in Asia for next to no gains. So, let us get down to it, starting with the lifeblood of any military: manpower. The Russian Federation has in excess of 800,000 active duty military personnel, with 2 million reservists. The Russian definition of a reservist is anyone that has completed conscript or contract service and are under the age of 42, with the age being higher for officers of certain ranks. The expected quality of these reserve troops vary wildly from source to source, with some claiming 200,000 trained reserve personnel undergoing exercises 2 to 3 times per month, or at the very least 1 month out of the year. Others suggest the number may be as low as 2,000. But in the name of charity, we will assume the larger number to be accurate, giving Russia a manpower total of 1 million men that are either immediately ready for war or can be made ready within about a month or so. But of course, the days of sheer massed infantry warfare are long gone, so we also need to look at the armoured numbers. Russia has the single largest tank fleet in the world, though its current numbers are much debated, and their worth on the modern battlefield even more so. We are going again to go for the largest estimates available here, giving the Russian army some 12,000 main battle tanks, 30,000 IFVs and APCs, and 6,500 self-propelled artillery pieces with 10,000 other guns, including towed artillery and rocket artillery. Tremendous force, and a sizable portion of it are considered modern vehicles. The T-72, B-3M and T-90s are not outdated tanks. Similarly, the Mstar, SPG and BMP/BTR series of IFVs and APCs are not particularly inferior to Western equivalents. And I shan't go into direct comparisons here, as frankly, comparing the various vehicles like the Bradley versus the BMP series, or the M1A2 versus the T90, etc., well, these are massive subjects, worthy of their own 30 to an hour long videos, frankly, well outside the scope of a simple force comparison. We are going to mention this briefly later on, but for now we are going to move on to the Air Force. And a convincing argument can be made that in a modern war this is the comparison to be made, as whichever side gains and maintains air superiority is going to enjoy a quite possibly war-ending advantage. Russia has 770 fighters/interceptors, 740 attackers, which includes close air support and bombers, and 2,087 helicopters, out of which about a third are attack helicopters, and finally 20 tanker aircraft. Now, you may be wondering why the tankers are included, as at first flush they don't seem all that important, but on the contrary, in modern air operations, tankers are the key. They allow aircraft to travel further, stay on station longer, and coordinate more effectively, as several air groups can take off from different fields, rendezvous on tankers, top off, and set off together on joint operations. As to the Russian Air Force's efficiency, well, we will return to this point later, as it is a bit of a larger subject. For now, we will look at the final branch of the Russian Armed Forces, the Navy. The Russian Navy has one aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, or to be precise, the Russians refer to it as a heavy aircraft cruiser, as its role is quite different to that of the US carriers. The US carriers are intended as literally floating air bases. They are strike craft designated to destroy enemy navies or coastal installations, as well as even large-scale raids on enemy strategic installations on land. They are almost purely so swords, whereas the Admiral Kuznetsov is designed to protect the Russian fleet, to defend it against enemy air attacks with its own fighter patrols, and to counter enemy submarines with a large number of aircrafts and helicopters. And it is also armed with a selection of anti-ship missiles, allowing the Admiral Kuznetsov to engage enemy shipping as well, using its cruise missile weaponry. However, the Kuznetsov is currently undergoing refitting, and due to apparent accidents during the refitting and repair process, it will not be available until estimated at some point in 2024. But with current sanctions, that number is speculative at best. The Russian Navy also has 26 destroyers and frigates, out of which 15 are destroyers and 70 submarines. Without the Admiral Kuznetsov, though, the fleet, except for the submarine arm, is unlikely to see much in the way of effective deployment. Let us then move on to looking at the strengths of the competition, the United States and NATO, before doing a direct comparison at the end. I will make a distinction between the US and NATO for two reasons. The first is that the US contribution to the alliance is by far the largest. And secondly, because the US will only be able to allocate parts of its enormous military to a European conflict. A large part, to be sure, the largest probably even, but the US has many commitments around the world, particularly in keeping the dragon in check. So, the United States of America has some 1,390,000 active duty personnel, and between 400,000 to 500,000 reserve personnel allocated to a wide number of National Guard formations and Army, Navy, Marine reserves, for a total of 1.89 million men altogether. In terms of armor, the US has 6,600 tanks, 45,000 IFVs and APCs, 1,490 SPGs, and 2,700 towed and rocket artillery. Just like their Russian counterparts, incidentally, a lot of this equipment is starting to show its age, with various upgrade programs currently underway, like the M1A2 SEP V4 upgrade package and the M1A3 project still in the pipeline. But the real star of the US Armed Forces is, of course, its Air Force, with 1,957 fighters, 783 attackers, and 6,373 helicopters, 910 being attack helicopters, and a staggering 627 tankers. The US Air Force is, by a country mile, the greatest on Earth. I imagine as well that the Navy might feel a sense of outrage at the Air Force star status, as the US Navy is just as titanic a beast, with 11 aircraft carriers plus 6 helicarriers, 92 destroyers, and 68 submarines. Its sea dominance is, of course, a vital necessity for the world's only superpower, as it's located on the other side of the Atlantic. And so, let us have a look at the other part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the ones that are going to have to hold the line until the American White Knight arrives. We will be looking at NATO as a single entity because, well, many of the country's contributions are frankly not that great, and many NATO countries have been spending far less on their defense than they are technically obligated to by their treaty obligations. So, we begin with military manpower as well, where NATO has 1,975,000 active military personnel, with another 1.5 million in various types of reserves. This also includes paramilitary organizations like, for example, the French Gendarmerie. In total then, NATO has in excess of 3.4 million men, with the standing armed forces of broadly similar quality, whilst the reserves and paramilitary troops can vary a great deal. In armoured strength, it has 5,336 main battle tanks, 57,000 IFVs and APCs, 5,500 SPGs, and 15,000 other artillery pieces. Once more, often of a drastically differing quality, everything from Germany's top modern Leopard 2 A7s to ancient-ass Romanian T-55s. Providing air cover to all of this, NATO has 1,570 fighters, 265 attackers, 3,440 helicopters, and 51 tankers. Finally, on the wet side of things, NATO brings another 6 carriers, 154 destroyers and frigates, and 76 submarines. Bringing it all together then, NATO boasts 17 carriers, 246 destroyers and frigates, 144 submarines, 3,527 fighters, 1,048 attackers, 8,903 helicopters, 678 tankers, 11,936 main battle tanks, 102,000 IFVs and APCs, 6,990 self-propelled guns, 17,700 rocket and towed artillery pieces, and 5,365,000 men. Let us then compare these numbers to Russia. In terms of land forces, manpower, Russia has 1 million compared to 5.3 million NATO personnel. Now, of course, this is without increased recruitment and mass mobilization. The potential manpower pool of both alliances are many times larger than this if they were to pull out all the stops. But even then, NATO's total population absolutely dwarfs that of Russia, as the United States alone more than doubles Russia's total population. The other numbers too are none too promising. NATO more than triples Russia's IFV and APC capabilities. They have a slight advantage in self-propelled guns and nearly double the number of towed and rocket artillery. Only in tanks is Russia an equal match for NATO. Though bear in mind, only a relatively small portion of both sides' tanks are truly modern tanks, either with significant upgrade packages or produced in the last couple of decades. There are a lot of outdated vehicles on both sides. This holds true for the IFVs, APCs, self-propelled guns and other artillery as well, with varying degrees of modernity advantages to one side or the other. All in all, the numbers here are certainly favouring NATO, but they are not necessarily crushingly advantageous. When we move on, however, to the Air Force category, the numbers begin to look far less favourable for Russia, as we have 770 fighters versus 3,527. The air war, therefore, is likely to heavily favour NATO, forcing Russia to rely on its anti-air capabilities to prevent NATO air superiority. And this is where we will bring up the topic of the Russian Air Force's performance in Ukraine, as they have certainly not been particularly impressive. You will note that the number of attacker aircraft are fairly similar, 740 to 1,048. Now, of course, this does not take into consideration that a lot of the fighters can undoubtedly be equipped with ground attack ordnance as well. But the real clue here lies in the ability to suppress the enemy's air defenses both on the ground and on the air. NATO has the fighters to win the air war, and it has the experience and the technology to win the SEAD campaign, the suppression of enemy air defenses. Meanwhile, Russia, even if they had somehow managed to win the air war, judging by their efforts in Ukraine, would not have the capabilities to carry out an effective SEAD campaign against NATO, as they have failed to eliminate Ukraine's aerial defenses, still losing aircrafts even now, months after the war has begun. Whereas when the US enters into a war zone, the first thing they target is enemy air defenses, as once these are cleared out of the way, the Air Force is free to bomb, harass and destroy the enemy. This is based partially upon a difference in philosophy between Russia and the US. The US has, through its various war experiences, realized that enemy air defenses should not merely be suppressed, they should be neutralized wherever possible as an objective in and of itself. Whereas Russia has tried instead to suppress enemy air defenses whilst they are engaged in operations, focusing not on destroying them, but simply keeping them quiet whilst the attackers carry out their jobs. This has proven to not be as effective as Russia perhaps had hoped it would. In terms of helicopters too, you can see a pretty heavy advantage in NATO's favour, and in tankers as well, there is a clear NATO advantage. This means that NATO will have far more range, far more strategic flexibility, and far more of an ability to keep attacking consistently with overwhelming numbers without having to rely as much on airfields. The helicopter advantage as well means they will be able to support their ground forces with more and better direct support and firepower. Finally, in the naval department, it is a crushing advantage. There are 17 NATO carriers to Russia's 1, 246 destroyers and frigates to Russia's 26, and 144 submarines to 70. Now, in my humble opinion, everything besides the submarines and the carriers, to a certain degree, for some nations, is basically obsolete anyway. So, a few guided missile destroyers can certainly do a job here and there, but effectively, everything is food to the submarine. Though carriers have, of course, their advantages, the simple fact is, for all but a tiny handful of nations on Earth, carriers are simply too large and expensive to be worth it. But that is a rant for another day. NATO will undoubtedly win the sea war, unless Russia has been keeping something remarkably secret up their sleeve. Yet there is one metric that tells the tale even more starkly than that. The total military budget of Russia was $65.9 billion US. The total military budget of NATO was $1.2 trillion. In all due honest reality, the only true advantage Russia has over NATO is that it has slightly more nuclear weapons than the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But once again, once we start bringing nukes into the equation, really all of the previous numbers become irrelevant. Besides perhaps the total military budget when it comes to developing an effective way to actually intercept nuclear weaponry. But again, when the mushroom cloud starts flying, all forms of conventional warfare really becomes irrelevant. So, finally, as a conclusion, Russia versus NATO. Is Russia a danger to NATO? No, it is not. Russia cannot hope to beat NATO as it stands right now. Bearing in mind, of course, that both sides will not commit all of the numbers I've talked about here. A more realistic estimate might be to take about 10, 15 or 20% of those numbers, and then you've probably got the roughly realistic combat forces. You also have to take into consideration whether or not it will be a quick war, as World War III, as I've made an entire video talking about, will either be a lightning victory for one side or the other, most likely NATO in this case, or it will bog down, as all of our fancy toys will fail to do what we were hoping they would do, and we will instead get to World War III, the trench war repeat of World War I, in which case we might actually see the numbers we've talked about today. And finally, an alternative question as well. Does Russia have anything to fear from NATO? Now, it might seem a silly question. After all, NATO has never aggressively invaded another country. Oh, they have certainly engaged in military interventions on a couple of times, and they were called into the war in Afghanistan by America, but that was due to the triggering of Article 5, as the US had been attacked by a foreign power, an identifiable military organization, and thus an attack on one is an attack on all. NATO does not seem particularly likely to be the initiating party in a large-scale war, certainly not against a major power like Russia. However, one can also not really deny that NATO has been encircling Russia for quite some time now, and calls in the West amongst the civilian population and amongst a frightening number of politicians as well are getting more and more strident every day that some sort of intervention must be made in Ukraine. Now, personally, whilst I understand the reasoning to protect a nation that is under attack, Ukraine is not a NATO country, and if NATO forces or air power enters into Ukrainian airspace in an active military role, there really is no other way for Russia to reasonably interpret that other than a declaration of war. Now again, to be precise, I do not view this as a realistic scenario. Despite mounting outrage and pressure from many areas, NATO has been very clear that it does not intend to engage militarily in the conflict, and I hope that it does not do so. So, in all due likelihood and hopefulness, no, Russia does not have anything to fear from NATO either. At the very least, not militarily. Economically, may be a different matter entirely. Until next time, though, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. If you liked the video, please do consider leaving a like and a comment, and maybe sharing the video around a little bit, as these are interesting topics, I do believe, and flatter myself by thinking that I do an alright job at presenting it. Till next time, have a good day.